And so I'm hoping that out of this, you really get another level of mastery of how to use this system, because I'm very much intrigued by bringing the classical methods of the ancient world up to the digital methods of the modern world. And it is a powerful tool that can be applied to digital design. It was the study of geometry that allowed our ancestors to build these amazing structures of old. I mean, the Egyptians knew geometry, the Babylonians knew geometry, the megalithic builders of Northern Europe, they had a very sophisticated understanding of geometry. In Indochina, the designers and builders of the great temple complexes in Indochina, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and so on, they also had a very in-depth working knowledge of geometry. Now, they had this belief that geometry was fundamental to all of creation. And there's a number of very interesting quotes that sort of express the general philosophy behind sacred geometry. And one of those is that, God was the great geometrician. And God created the universe by means of compasses. There's a famous quote from Proverbs about God creating the universe by setting his compasses upon the face of the deep, right? So that idea has been intrinsic to fundamental spiritual and religious outlooks. I mean, because most of the ancient architecture that we see and that we can cite as exemplifying the principles of sacred geometry had a sacred purpose to it. Now archaeologists look at many of these ancient structures like Stonehenge or some of the monumental earthworks of the Ohio River Valley or Mississippi River Valley or the Chacoan culture, whatever, and they say, well, it was a ceremonial purpose. Why was Chaco Canyon erected and built? With Casa Rinconada and Casa Bonita, and et cetera. Well, it's recognized that they probably weren't inhabited, that they weren't, in other words, they weren't residences that people lived in. They were purely ceremonial. And it seems like the explanation of ceremony or religious ritual or so on seems to be enough to say, well, it was ceremonial. But what does that actually mean? Ceremonial to what end? What was actually going on? Now, here's the thing. When you start looking at sacred geometry, and let me segue for a minute. I don't know the origin of sacred geometry as compared to just geometry. However, there was a book, a 2-volume set, that came out in the early 1950s that focused primarily on ecclesiastical architecture of the Middle Ages. And the use of geometry there was endemic to the whole system, the sacred geometry of the Gothic cathedrals. And so he explored the geometric basis for the design of the great cathedrals. He also showed that the same system was involved. For example, the Romans were using it, the Greeks were using some aspect of the same system. Well, it's grown incredibly since then. The advent of the internet has certainly brought a lot of attention to the subject, far in excess of what it was a generation or two ago. And there have been a lot of new interesting books written on it. I have one of the new books that had just come out on the subject, which is a really great treatment. As it says there, The Language of the Angels. Now, what does that mean? I'm not going to get into that in this little short discussion we're doing today, but this presents to me one of the most profound ideas at the core of sacred geometry, is that it provides a method of communication that transcends cultural differences, language differences, religious differences, because it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, what your religious beliefs are, whether you're profoundly spiritual, whether you're atheists, doesn't matter. The relationship of the diagonal to a square to its side is the same, universally. It's always the same, right? So what it is geometry provides a not only a methodology, but a language that can transcend the ethnic and cultural and religious differences and so on. Yes, completely opposite sides of the world, right? Now, Angkor Wat's in Cambodia, and it exhibits the forms and patterns of sacred geometry. Specifically, we can see, and this is one of the things that I demonstrate in the workshops, is like in Angkor Wat, there's a temple complex that manifests the relationship, the square root of 2, which is, I just mentioned that regardless of what your cultural background is, the relationship of the diagonal of a square to its side is always the same. And the consistent ratio that you find is the square root of 2. So anytime you have a square and you want to know the length of its diagonal, you simply multiply that side length by the square root of 2. If you know the diagonal and you want to know the side length of the square, you divide by the square root of 2. And, you know, on any calculator, simple calculator that you get like we've got here, I use the TI 30XA. It's very simple. I just put in, watch this now, okay? So I'm going to put in 2, and hopefully you can maybe see it there. Okay, then all I got to do is hit one key. There's one key right here. I put my finger on it right there, which is the square root key. So I hit that, and what I now have is the value of the square root of 2. So give me, let's say you're laying out you're going to do a painting, and you're going to paint it in a square. Give me any side length that you would use of the square. 12 inches. So now I've got that, right? And I go times 12, and what that tells me is that the diagonal of the square is 16.97, or in round number 17. And it's interesting that you chose 12 inches because there's a rule that we as builders and carpenters and so on have used for decades and decades. That was one of the first things I learned, which was the 1712 rule. Because we're constantly using this relationship. Any carpenter worth their salt, at least in the old days, were taught the 17 to 12 rule. That if you have a square and it's 12 inches on its side, its diagonal is going to be 17. And you constantly are using that principle when you're laying out staircases, when you're designing roofs, anywhere, and you need to know an angle. Anyways, we use it constantly, that particular rule. And in building, you saw that it was 12 times the square root of 2 was 16.97 something. Well, but we round that to 17 inches, and it's so close. It's in practical applications, that little few thousandths of a difference doesn't matter. So, same way, if we had a square that was 12 feet on a side, we could think of its diagonal as 17 feet. And so when you're laying out, for example, a hip roof, in a hip roof, you've got your hip rafters, which are 45 degrees to your common rafters. Well, the diagonal of a square is 45 degrees to its side. You see, so if you were to take a hip roof, which is a three-dimensional form, project it onto a flat plane, the hip rafters or the valley rafters would be the diagonals of squares, see? So you can, the relationship in a roof, if you're laying out a roof, and any carpenter who happens to be listening to this should know this, that if you're laying out a roof, you know that the ratio of the common rafters to the hip rafters is going to be that 1712 rule. So it's interesting that you picked that, because that is used throughout by carpenters and builders, masons and so on. But one of the things that's regrettable is the fact that a lot of these principles that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers knew by heart that were builders are kind of getting lost. And part of what I like to do in these workshops is revive some of these techniques, because they're very powerful. When it comes to designing and knowing how to build, they're extremely powerful, and they have broad-based applications. Well, anything related to design at all. And I have had, when I do my classes and workshops, there's, of course, the philosophical side, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But the practical side is that you can use it as a design tool to increase the probabilities of harmony amongst the composition or the design and the elements of the design. I'll talk about that in a second. But any craft, in my workshops and classes, I've had, of course, many carpenters. I've had many architects, interior designers. I've had landscape architects that are designing gardens and so forth. I've had stained glass workers that were designing and creating stained glass. I've had tile setters that were doing, coming up with patterns and compositions and designs to be rendered in tile and mosaics and so on. Gosh, what else? Furniture builders. The list goes on. Artists, who want to set up a canvas and have certain principles inherent in that canvas, principles of harmony. Here, the thing about geometry is that when you start looking at these relationships amongst the various elements of geometry, just like, for example, the relationship of the diagonal of a square to its side, you can render that into numerical frequencies, right? And, for example, if you look at the visible spectrum of light, you're roughly, from just over 4,000 angstroms up to a little bit less than 8,000 angstroms. Well, if you take the frequencies, let's say of the most intense red, and that's marked by I'm not going to get into the technicality of it, but there's a line in there that's called the Fraunhofer line that sits very close to the most intense part of like the red band of the visible light spectrum, the green band, the blue band, and so on. Well, it turns out that these relationships that we find in geometry are also the ratios of the frequencies of the various colors of the spectrum in terms of their the wavelength measure in angstroms. And we do get into that somewhat. And so it's something that I know there's a number of artists that are looking at the spectrum of color and incorporating those frequencies into the colors that they're using. But it's you've got that component, but then you've also got the spatial relationships that you get when you have certain geometric forms that are dynamic, let's say, as contrasted with static. What's the difference? Well, a dynamic form is one that can be easily subdivided into replications of itself or expanded as replications of itself. Now, in geometry, we have a couple of terms like similarity and congruity. Similarity is when you have two geometric forms of the same shape. Congruity is which is also referred to as when two forms are identical. It means they're not only the same shape, but they're the same size, so that if you juxtaposed one figure on top of another figure and they display congruency, they're going to completely juxtapose. Similarity, again, means that they're the same shape but different size. Now, there's a term in modern mathematics called fractal self-similarity. In fractal self-similarity, what you've got is that the ratios and proportions embodied in the whole are reflected in each of the parts. It was understood by the ancient designers and builders and so on that this relationship was the key to creating harmony. Knowing how to take a figure and divided it up in such a way that there's this relationship between the part and the whole. That's the key to harmony in design, is knowing that relationship between the part and the whole and being able to consciously control that relationship. Now, a lot of good intuitive artists will manifest those relationships, but without necessarily being conscious of the fact they're doing it. What sacred geometry does though, is it gives you a tool that you can use consciously and intentionally. So across the spectrum of arts and crafts and design and so on, there's all kinds of potential for applications of the principles. But it also, one of the things I like to emphasize to people is this, that when you think of geometry, virtually across the board, everybody's going to think of forms in space, two-dimensional forms, a pentagon, a hexagon, an octagon. These are polygons. They're in two-dimensional space. Then you have like the polyhedra, the solids. You could have the 5 platonic polyhedra, the 13 semi-regular Archimedean solids, and so on. Now you're in the third dimension, right? So far, we're talking about relationships within space, spatial relationships that can be analyzed with the 3 axes, horizontal, and like your X, Y, and Z axes. So you've got one line this way, one line this way, and another axis this way, and you can then segue from regular geometry into what we call analytical geometry. I won't get into that here. In some of the advanced courses, we do get into that because that expands the power of the system and how we can use it today in ways that perhaps our ancestors were not able to use. But here's the thing I'm getting at. When you start looking at those ratios and those proportions, you get numbers. Right? Those numbers come out, and those numbers can define frequencies. Okay? We look at those. We look at these numbers. What are the numbers that are generated out of the relationships of geometric form in space? Well, it also turns out that sacred geometry and the ratios and proportions apply to the measurement not only of space but to time itself, which now brings us back to a much more an earlier or archaic model of creation of reality, which is that time is cyclical. And that, the relatively famous metaphor in Ezekiel of wheels within wheels seems to be very apropos in terms of talking about cycles within cycles. And so when I teach sacred geometry, we also look at the timing, the tempo, the rhythms of temporal change and how that may affect life here on Earth. And that was an integral part of the understanding of ancient geometry, was that there is a set of numbers, cosmological numbers, if you will, that apply both to the measurement of space and of time. And so that brings us into a whole other realm of the power of geometry. One of the key components of the ancient eschatological traditions and prophetic traditions was this idea that if you understood the relationship of the cycles, the microcycles, the human cycles, the macrocycles, you were in a position to have some sense of predictability. You could predict what was coming down the pike. And so that is one, to me, very profound application of these principles. Well, so in the retreat, what we're going to do is it's going to be hands-on. We're going to have everybody, as part of the tuition, everybody gets one of these hardwood compasses that we make in our shop here. Yeah, and they work very nicely. I never, when I started doing these classes, I was having a hard time finding a good flexible compass. Architects' compasses were great, and when I was learning engineering, drafting, and design back in the 70s, that's what I used. But they just weren't suitable for what I wanted to do in a workshop. So we came up with our own design. The original concept was my old friend Jeremy Lyons. He came up with the first iteration of this, and then through experience, we perfected it, I think. And the idea is, like, for example, we just have a bulldog clip. I remove that. I can stick this in here like this, and I'm good to go from pencil to pen to gel pen to felt tip marker, whatever. So the tuition cost includes one of these compasses along with all the other supplies that a student would need to participate, including we include the TI-30XA calculator, and in the workshop, we learn how to use the basic functions, and they're super simple. You don't have to have mathematical skills to be able to, just like we did. When you asked, we converted the side of a square 12 inches to its diagonal. It was just, you put the number in, one push of the button, you got an answer, right? This is not so much a scientific calculator because we don't need that level of functionality, but this will do, so part of the instructions, we learn how to use this, do simple calculations, because look, if you're an artist and you want to lay out a canvas, it helps to be able to know, square root of 2, square root of 3. If I want to have that, pretty much that root 3 rectangle shape for my canvas, if I've got one length, I can easily calculate the other length. If I know the length of my canvas, I can easily calculate my width. And then once I've got that particular rectangle, I know that what I will have learned in the workshop is why that rectangle is referred to as dynamic rather than static, is because of this principle of infinite replicability, that we can have control over the relationship of the part and the whole. And that is the key to harmony right there. Well, and then to me, the challenge is, how do we take this knowledge that was so universally understood by our predecessors on the planet, how do we adapt that to our own time to increase the totality of harmony in the world? And that was one of the practical objectives, was the expanding and increasing the amount of harmony in the world. And we've forgotten that. And I think there's a direct relation to some of the chaos we see happening in society, the wars, the conflicts, the crime, everything down to homelessness can be, I think, connected to this loss of harmony and beauty within into the worlds that we create to live in. I want to bring some of that back. I want to bring back the principles of harmony and teach these to people. I started studying this in 1973, so I've got a little bit of street cred under my belt on this. There's a lot more to learn. I don't claim to know all of it. There's a small handful of us that have been studying this for decades. I'm going to do my part to try to get it out there, get people interested in it, and to begin using it as a system and to experiment with it to see where we can go and what we can do to improve our living conditions by bringing in more harmony. What's happening now is, I think there's an evolving worldwide community of people that recognize there's much more to life, to creation, to history, to ancient times than has previously been recognized. And I think this worldwide community is coming together. And what I would like to do is make 50 years of study and research and the tools that I've learned available to anyone that could make use of them. and join this community, this worldwide community that's forming. I'll mention HowTube is going to be kind of like a hub of this whole system of educating people about these things. And so I think that to me is also one of the exciting things about this, is because there's a small handful of us researchers, and I'll be talking about other people's work in the retreat, who are doing amazing things out there as well, on many levels. And so that to me is one of the exciting parts about it, of this whole phenomena that's happening right now as we speak, is this people all around the planet waking up and realizing that there's a much richer, deeper understanding of history, of nature, of the creative process available to us now that wasn't available a couple of generations ago. So if you participate in this, that's also part of it, is that you are now, to the extent that you want to, you're becoming a part of this worldwide movement and this community of seekers and researchers and builders and people who are trying to take these principles and apply them to making our modern day world a better place.